everybody. I'm just going to give us a few key points about where we are and where we might be headed over the coming year. I decided to start with the big question. What is the probability of a recession in 2020? The Wall Street Journal asked about 60 economists this question, and their answers are displayed in the bar chart. And you see quite a bit of variation. So some economists saying slim to no chance, and then clear up upwards of 60% chance of a recession. But on average, these economists said about a 24% chance of a recession in 2020. If you were here last year, that's about the same. Compared to 2 years ago, this is almost double the chance. So we do see this sort of increase over time, but some relative confidence in another year of stability. In terms of GDP growth, these same economists were asked for their projections of what might be happening at the quarterly level over 2020. And in general, they predicted the economy to grow at about 1.9%. Each quarter in 2020. So that's a little lower than where we were in quarter 2 and quarter 3 of 2019, but still kind of this slow and steady growth. In terms of what that means for Wisconsin, I'm showing you here some historical GDP trends. So we have Wisconsin in red and the United States in orange. Wisconsin generally sits a little bit below the US average, so if these predictions are on track for 2020, we might expect still positive growth for Wisconsin, but relatively slow or lagging compared to the country as a whole. One thing that I like to highlight here is when we're talking about Wisconsin, how is Wisconsin doing? I think it's important to keep in mind that it depends. It depends on where you live. There's actually quite a bit of variation within the state. This is sort of beta version data from the BEA. They've started to release GDP growth at the county level. So I suspect they're still working out the kinks. At the same time, I think this map is useful for keeping in mind that variation within the state. Some places doing quite well, thank you very much, and other states struggling. What I'll point out, though, here is the color scheme. So on average, counties in Wisconsin from the most recent year, 2017 to 2018, grew between 4 and 5%. Those counties are represented kind of in the middle at gray. So I'm showing you the average in the middle. So even some of the counties in red still had positive growth. They're just below that county level average. All of the counties in blue are those above average. So again, quite a bit of variation within the state. So I'll turn from GDP to employment growth. So coming back to those national level predictions and what these economists at the Wall Street Journal think. So they were asked, where will we be going forward at the quarterly level for 2020? And they predict around 150,000 jobs added monthly through the first half of 2020, but then declining over time. So by the end of 2020, those predictions were closer to 100,000 jobs in that monthly jobs report that we have our eye on. So I want to make what I think is an important connection between employment growth and entrepreneurship. So in the US, this is what I'm showing you is actually for Wisconsin. So in Wisconsin, for the most recent year available, which is 2016, 3.2 out of every 10 jobs came from a new business, from an entrepreneur starting a new business. So entrepreneurs are disproportionately responsible for job growth. The remaining 6.5 jobs that you see would come from expansions. Oftentimes we lose those because they're offset when existing businesses close or contract or lay off a few workers. So entrepreneurs, those jobs we're getting from new businesses are especially important in terms of sustaining and enhancing job growth going forward. When we think about the bigger picture, we've had a fairly slow jobs recovery since the last recession, particularly in our rural areas. Some of our rural areas are just recently getting back to pre-recession levels. And so again, I think understanding entrepreneurship and that link to job growth is really important. If we want to have sustained job growth, understanding this decline in the establishment birth rate per 1,000 employees, I think is important. In terms of the research we're seeing, entrepreneurial strategies tend to hold a lot of promise in terms of sustained job growth going forward. So the flip side of that, these economists, again, thinking about the predictions for the coming year, show a kind of slow and steady uptick in the unemployment rate at the national level. So starting kind of here more recently with 3.5% and upwards of 4% by 2022, so slow increases in unemployment. So it kind of all fits together, perhaps kind of slow, steady but slightly declining GDP growth, slow but steady, slightly declining employment growth, and then these slight increases in unemployment. With those in mind, I want to also remind us of this relatively tight labor market we're seeing. Here, this graph is the ratio of the unemployed population to job openings. So the peak of the graph is the recession. In the recession, we had upwards of 7 people available or looking for work for every 1 job opening. So workers were competing for jobs at that point. Where we are now in the Midwest, unfortunately this isn't available for Wisconsin specifically, but where we are now in the Midwest is less than 1 worker available per job opening. So I suspect to continue to hear about employers having a hard time finding finding workers over the coming year. The tables have really turned. Now we hear about employers competing for workers rather than workers competing for jobs. It's a different scenario. One of the factors that is keeping pressure on the labor market is the aging demographic in Wisconsin. So here I'm showing you the prime age share of the population in Wisconsin based on population projections going forward. So starting with 2015 and ending in 2040. I'm focusing on the prime age share of the population because that's really the meat of our labor force. From ages 25 to 54, that's the largest share of the labor force. That's when labor force participation rates are highest. So as our retirees exit the labor force, we really don't have the population coming in behind them to replace those workers. So I expect to see that factor continue to put some pressure on the labor market. With that in mind, I continue to hear employers pursuing strategies of recruiting employees in different ways. Several of my extension colleagues are involved in different efforts to think about new labor pools. So Wisconsin has pretty high labor force participation rates, so there's not a lot of slack in the economy in terms of getting new workers into jobs. There's not a lot of people sitting on the sidelines. We're starting to think about where are different potential labor pools that we maybe haven't thought of before. So there have been efforts in terms of working with the previously incarcerated, thinking about reentry, how do we more fully incorporate these folks into the labor force. I talked to one employer who can't find the workers that he needs in his city, so he's looking at opening kind of a remote work center in a rural area. As long as they have internet, he can employ them from long distance and get the workers he needs that way. One of the efforts that I want to highlight is about childcare, just because it's been related to some of the work that we've been doing in Extension. And so here, what I'm showing you is the labor force participation rate in Wisconsin by age and gender. So the prime age categories are kind of in the bolder colors, that 25 to 54. And what you see is that for women, their labor force participation rate is lower in all of those age categories. Research suggests that this has a lot to do with child rearing and the availability of childcare. Certainly it affects families, men and women alike, but it does seem to affect women more acutely. So in terms of thinking about childcare as a workforce development strategy, that seems to have some merit. So it's not the case, I don't expect that all of the women who aren't working would be with childcare. But if those red lines were all even with the black lines, that's about 70,000 more women in the labor force. So a fairly large pool that we're talking about where I think that childcare, raising young children is part of their calculus in terms of getting to work. So a few just summary key points. Economy seems to be performing at a slow and steady pace, but there's lots of variation within the state. Job growth is expected to slow and the unemployment rate expected to rise. I think higher rates of entrepreneurship are going to be important for continued job growth. And we still have this tight labor market in the state. Our workforce is aging, and our employers are definitely starting to think about different potential labor pools and where they might get more workers. Thank you for your time.